2017, the Community Foundation of the Fox River Valley produced this video to tell the story of the early history of St. Charles, Illinois. This video also is a tribute to the many residents of the city who have promoted philanthropy through our organization. Due to its length, the video is divided into 5 sections for the convenience of the viewer. These sections are a country town, building a city, the Gates-Baker-Norris era, education, and leisure, recreation, and parks. And now, the story of St. Charles, Illinois. Part 1. A country town, 1833 to 1880. The story of St. Charles begins in 1833, the year following the end of the Black Hawk War fought between the United States and Native Americans. As a result of the conflict, Native Americans were forced to relocate west of the Mississippi River, and European Americans began to move into Illinois in greater numbers. Many years later, the citizens of St. Charles erected this commemorative statue in Pottawatomie Park as a sign of respect for their former Native American residents called the Pottawatomies. In the fall of 1833, the area that would eventually become the city of St. Charles was first settled by Evan Shelby, a 33-year-old bachelor from Warren County, Indiana. Shelby staked his claim on a large tract of land on the east side of the river. The following March, Shelby convinced his brother-in-law, William Franklin, who was also from Indiana, to build a cabin at the settlement. In May 1834, Lydia Shelby Franklin, sister of Evan Shelby and wife of William Franklin, moved with her 2 children to the new homestead. It was a difficult and uncomfortable journey, but Lydia earned the distinction of becoming the first white woman to live within the original boundaries of St. Charles, Illinois. Dozens of other families also began arriving in 1834, including brothers Reed and Dean Fearson from Wethersfield, Vermont, brothers Ira and George Menard of Rockingham, Vermont, traveled with the Fearsons from their home state, but they did not settle in the area until 1835. That year, Evan Shelby gave Reed Fearson and Ira Menard 8 acres of his riverfront property in exchange for their promise to build a dam, a sawmill, and a trading house. Fearson and Menard agreed, and they called the new settlement Charleston, which was the name of a town in their home state of Vermont. In early 1836, partners Fearson and Menard were joined by Calvin Ward, a settler from Massachusetts, who helped plan the town. The men hired surveyor Mark W. Fletcher, a Dartmouth graduate and native of Vermont, to lay out the east side of the town. On the same day, he mapped out the west side for another pioneer, Gideon Young. Fletcher married Harriet Dunham, whose father, Solomon, built a stately home that became the clubhouse for the Dunham Woods Riding Club in Wayne, Illinois. Harriet's brother, Mark Dunham, constructed Dunham Castle on the corner of Dunham and Army Trail Roads. This building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Sadly, the area's first settler, Evan Shelby, died in September 1837 and had no descendants to inherit his land. Ruth Pearson, in her book Reflections of St. Charles, tells the story that Shelby was buried in the town's first cemetery, which was located where the 1911 Shelby School was built. Others have concluded that it was the 1854 West Side School that replaced the cemetery. Regardless of those views, Shelby's grave was eventually moved to the South Cemetery on 7th Avenue. Shelby's sister and brother-in-law, William and Lydia Franklin, then moved their family west to California, where Lydia was eventually buried at her daughter Sarah Franklin Thurman's family gravesite in Fresno County, California. William's final resting place is unknown. Thus, after only a few short years, the three original pioneers of St. Charles were no longer a part of the settlement. Interestingly, Lydia and her brother Evan Shelby were related to Isaac Shelby, the first and fifth governor of Kentucky, who was also a soldier in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Historians also believe that Lydia's husband, William Franklin, was related to a brother of Benjamin Franklin. It appears that the first settlers of St. Charles had solid ties to the early years of our country. In the fall of 1836, Calvin Ward left the partnership of Menard and Pearson, and Bella Thaxter Hunt from Abington, Massachusetts, took his place. He arrived with valuable business experience received from his father, Captain Thomas Hunt. In the 1866 book, History of the Town of Abington, by Benjamin Hobart, the author stated that it was Captain Thomas Hunt who introduced the shoe business into Abington about the year 1793. It is clear that Bella Hunt inherited his father's strong work ethic and creative spirit, as evidenced by his extraordinary contributions to his new hometown of St. Charles. The area continued to attract people of vision, drive, and education. Stevens S. Jones from Vermont was a lawyer, publisher, and judge. As an aside, research has confirmed that Stevens was indeed the correct spelling of his first name. Jones lived in a large house on East Main Street. He opened a law practice in 1839 in a small structure that adjoined his home. During the Civil War, the office served as a military recruiting headquarters and later as a holding cell for deserting soldiers. In 2014, the building was moved to Langham Park. Jones is remembered primarily for suggesting that Charleston be renamed St. Charles, when it was discovered that a town called Charleston already existed in Illinois. He was so well regarded that renowned American folk artist Sheldon Peck painted his portrait in 1841. The painting is part of the impressive collection owned by the St. Charles History Museum. The partnership of Menard, Pearson, and Hunt continued until the death of Reed Pearson in 1865. These three men were devoted to St. Charles and had a profound influence upon its development. It is appropriate, therefore, to highlight the lives of each at this time. Ira Menard was a financial genius who became one of the wealthiest men in northern Illinois through the art of land speculation. He helped organize Kane County in 1836 and was elected a state senator in 1842. He invested personal money and time in an unsuccessful attempt to bring a new railroad line through St. Charles. However, he was successful in making it possible for the laying of roads for a stage route. Finally, he built the first company store near the dam. Menard, His wife, Sarah Wheeler Menard, and their children lived in a palatial home between 2nd and 3rd Avenues on Main Street. Their son, George, lived in the home until 1928, when it was torn down and replaced by the McCornack service station. Years later, it was owned by Texaco, and then became home to the St. Charles History Museum. Menard died in 1876 at the age of 67 and is buried in the St. Charles North Cemetery. The second partner, Reed Fearson, married Clorinda Wheeler, the sister of Ira Menard's wife. Clorinda was a strong advocate of temperance and raised their 6 children accordingly. The couple's first home was on the corner of Cedar and 3rd Avenues. Then they built a large brick home where the Baker Memorial United Methodist Church was eventually constructed. Fearson was a generous man, devoting many personal hours to the development of St. Charles, as well as donating land for various causes. The Fearsons instilled strong values of civic responsibility in their children and grandchildren. Their grandson, Ralph Richmond, was the mayor of St. Charles from 1957 to 1961. And Richmond School was named after their granddaughter, Harriet Richmond, who was an educator in the Elgin and St. Charles schools for 34 years. Reed Fearson died at the age of 56 in 1865 and is buried in the St. Charles North Cemetery. Notice the spelling of Fearson's first name on the gravestone. Research shows that R-E-A-D appears on the land grant from President Tyler and also is the middle name of his son James. Why the gravestone is spelled R-E-E-D remains a mystery. Through the years, the city of St. Charles has honored the Fearson family through the naming of Fearson Creek, Fearson Creek Road, Fearson Creek Elementary School, and Fearson Creek Park. The third partner, Bella Hunt, became a phenomenal business success and played a major role in developing St. Charles. He purchased additional land for the settlement to give it a strong and promising future. He managed the construction of the city's first frame building, bought several businesses in the downtown area, established a linseed oil factory, opened a tannery, built a paper mill employing 80 people, and in later life, operated a hardware store on 1st Avenue and Main Street. He also was a major in the Civil War and the first Kane County treasurer. In the early 1840s, Hunt built one of the first brick dwellings in town on Cedar Avenue. It was home to several generations of the Hunt family. For many years, it housed the Dunham Hunt Museum before reverting back to private ownership. Bella Hunt's son, Frank, served as the 4th, 8th, and 10th mayor of St. Charles. And his grandson, Edwin, was the 11th mayor, holding office for a total of 10 years. The Hunt family truly gave their heart and soul to the city. In the early 1850s, St. Charles appeared to be poised for growth. However, in 1853, a failed venture to bring a new railroad line from Chicago to St. Charles slowed the city's development. Although the St. Charles Branch Railroad operated in town in the 1850s, regular service was not provided by the line, thus limiting the town's further growth. While some viewed the lack of reliable railroad service as harmful to the city's progress, others believed it was a blessing in disguise, since the town retained its leisurely, comfortable pace. Although the Civil War further slowed the city's development in the 1860s, the town was alive with activity when it agreed to serve as the site of a major training camp for Union soldiers. Located in Langham Park, Camp Kane was home to the 8th Illinois Cavalry and later the 17th from 1861 to 1864. Local heroes in the war included lawyer and Congressman John Franklin Farnsworth. Farnsworth was a strong abolitionist who raised an army of 1,200 soldiers to form the 8th Illinois Cavalry. President Abraham Lincoln, a friend of Farnsworth's, called the 8th Illinois Cavalry Farnsworth's Big Abolition Regiment. Elon Farnsworth, nephew of John Farnsworth, was a brigadier general who was killed in July 1863 while leading his men in a charge against the Confederates at the Battle of Gettysburg. As he lay dying, he continued to encourage his soldiers to fight for the cause. A historical marker in tribute to Farnsworth is located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the local post of the Grand Army of the Republic was named in his honor. St. Charles Postmaster J. S. Van Patten served as quartermaster of the 1st Battalion of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. He supplied rations to each soldier for 16 cents. The regiment was considered one of the best fed and best equipped in the Union Army. In civilian life, Van Patten was the owner of a drugstore on Main Street, which he purchased in 1854 and continued to operate after the war. Another local hero was Marcellus E. Jones, a second lieutenant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Jones is remembered for firing the first shot at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863, after Private Thomas B. Kelly, also in the St. Charles 8th Illinois Cavalry, warned his fellow soldiers of approaching Confederate troops. Colonel W. Marion McCarty of Texas led the Confederate Army against the Illinois Cavalry that day. Years later, the three men gathered to share stories of this tumultuous time in their lives. Throughout the war and beyond, St. Charles had become one of the largest concentrations of abolitionists in the country. It became an important station on the Underground Railroad, helping slaves during their journey to freedom in Canada. Lewis Klink was a blacksmith who sheltered slaves at his wagon and carriage shop until it was safe to transport them to the next stop. Other residents protected slaves in their homes and were instrumental in saving hundreds of lives. The James T. Wheeler Home served as one of the stations on the Underground Railroad. Between 1860 and 1900, the population of St. Charles increased by only 853, bringing the total number of residents to 2,675. Some characterize St. Charles as a deserted village in a stagnation period. However, with the help of local officials and the investment of business leaders, many changes occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s that re-energized the city. Part 2 of this video focuses on the transformation of St. Charles from a tranquil village to an engaging city.